Hello, my name is Darren Thomas, and I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. In this particular video, we are going to look at how to approach writing a methodology for a quantitative research paper. We're going to go through all of the various parts of it and look at some examples. So let's go ahead and see what we can learn. All right, when you are trying to write a methodology, you are trying to explain to your reader how you're going to answer your research questions, how you're going to answer your research question. We'll just say RQ for short to save time. How are you going to answer these research questions? And so this brings us back to the point of how critical your research questions are. And again, we need to remember that you start with a problem, and then you ask questions about the problem. So you got your questions right here, okay? Now don't forget, of course, that you read about the problem also. And so these things are happening kind of at the same time. After that, you have to explain how you're going to answer your questions. That's this step right here, and we're focusing on this right here. The how you're going to answer your research questions is your methodology. This is also sometimes called your instrumentation. And so you need to realize that there are basically 4 parts, it depends on who you're writing for, 4 parts to a methodology. You're going to have your sample, or sometimes it's called the setting, or it might be called both. It always depends on who you're writing for. You have your research design, RD for short. And then you have your data analysis, DA for short. And sometimes you have an ethics section, and we're going to call that E for short. So these are the 4 components that you're going to find most of the time when you're trying to go about developing your methodology. And these all must be grounded in your research questions. And so again, your problem and your research questions is often the most difficult part to develop when you are trying to make a study, because they lay the foundation for everything. And so if you blow this critical aspect of the development process of a paper, you are going to have serious problems down the road. Now, having said that, let's take a closer look at the sample. Inside the sample, you're going to have several subcomponents, if you will. You have to talk about the setting. This is kind of like where you're answering the where. Where did the study take place at? And also the when. If you're thinking about like the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, how. That's kind of where this is coming from. Then you have to also talk about your target population. I'm going to put TP for short. And this is basically who participated in your study. So you can see like you're setting up these 5 W's, not all of the W's, but most of them, where you're trying to provide for the reader where the study took place, when it took place, who participated, etc. After your target population, you have to deal with your sampling. And this is kind of like, how people were selected to participate. That's kind of how that works. So you can see the who, where, when, why, how. You don't really have the why here. The why is kind of explained in the introduction of your paper. But you can see how these 5 W's are really showing up here. And then sometimes, and I do this a lot of people don't do this, you might have some demographic stats here. Again, I'm talking about this is a methodology for a quantitative social science research paper. Now, again, other disciplines might do this differently, but this is what I've done in the past, and that has been considered acceptable by different readers, different journals, etc. Now that I've talked about this a little bit, I want to try to give you an example so that you can capture this. So here's a methodology that I wrote for a article, and you can see right here I start with the setting. So I hope you can see that and read that. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see that it's Thai students from all the different regions of Thailand. You can see that right there. Okay. And they're all at a university. Then I talk about the sampling, and so I use Stratify. Now I'm not going to talk about all the different types of sampling, but you have simple random, where like everybody has equal chance of being in the study. Then you might have systematic, where like you have some sort of a process where you skip like every other person can be in the study or whatever. Stratify is where you have a group, you divide the people based on a criteria like gender or major or whatever. Like you want 10% of music majors, 15% business majors, and you make sure your sample reflects that. And then you have convenience, which is kind of like whoever's available can participate. Again, this is we don't want to get into the details of that too much, but I have my sampling method right here. And then after that, all this information right here is like demographics, like how many freshmen and sophomores, how many men and women, how many by class level, etc. That's all right here. And this is the sampling section or the setting section. And for this journal, they call it participants and sampling. So different journals are going to have different names for it, but you have to understand that it's not the order you put the ingredients in that matters, as long as the ingredients are there when you're writing. So let's go back and take a look at the other parts of a paper, research paper here. All right. So our next section is going to be the research design. So for the research design, again, we're going to call this RD for short. Whoops, RD, research design. We have several things. First, you have to explain the type of research design. And when we're talking about the research design, it's kind of like what process are you going to like get the data? How are you going to go about analyzing it? The research design helps to explain those type of things. And so you can do a survey where you're collecting data with a survey. You could do an experiment, EXP for short, experiment. You could do, a correlational study. Again, I don't want to waste a lot of time on the details of each one of these types here. But these are different commonly used research designs. And so you have to explain to the reader what type of research design you're going to use and approach in your study, because there are certain rules for each type. And there's a certain type of analysis that is expected for each type. And again, that makes more sense when you take the mathematical statistical side of your research class. And so after that, you have to talk about, the scoring, or I guess you could say even they call it the instrumentation sometimes. And that's where you explain things like reliability, hope I spell it right. You also might talk about, how valid the study is, the validity, as another metric that is sometimes employed and when you explain things. And then one last thing you have to deal with is, of course, your data collection, DC. How did you go about actually getting your data? Did you collect it yourself? Did you have somebody else collect it? That's another part of the research design. And again, the way I'm explaining this is not the only way. Some people have other ways of doing this, and it's really up to you and your advisor or the journal you're trying to write for. So let's look at an example of this. So you can see right here in the next section called Research Designing Instruments. This is where I explain this. So I was using a cross-sectional survey for my study. And then I talk about where the data was collected from and by who. So this is like my data collection section right here. Some of this stuff can have its own subheading, and sometimes it's just represented by one sentence. So I collected the data for this study. And so then I had an instrument that was broken into two parts. It was a survey. Part one had demographic information. So like, what's their gender, what level are they, what's their major, etc. And then the second section was a Likert type scales that had about 44 statements that they had to respond to, whether they strongly disagree, agree, neutral, whatever. And so this helps the reader to understand, how you collect the data, who collected the data, what type of research design you're using, etc. You have to explain this because there's a belief that your study should be reproducible, or it could be replicated, if you will, if someone desired to do that. Now, for each of these subheadings here, like academic dishonesty, I explain specifically the scale that is used to measure academic dishonesty. So first I tell you where it came from, who made the scale. And then I give you some sample items these are actual statements from the scale right here. And then after that, I give you the Cronbach alpha, which is a measure of the reliability. So that's it right there. And then I repeat this process for all the variables in my study. All right, that's how this works. So it's really, really simple. So that is how you go about the research design. You have to explain the type of research design you're using. You have to, of course, go over the data collection. You have to go over the type of scoring method you're using. So I use the Likert scale item, disagree to strongly agree, whatever. And this is how you go about approaching this. So let's move now to the next one. And that is going to be the data analysis part. Now, again, when we're talking about data analysis, that's DA for short, remember that everything you're doing is grounded in your problem and your research questions. You cannot depart from that. And so the tools you use for your analysis, and I mean a statistical analysis, because we are focused here on quantitative social science research, the type of tool you use is shaped by your research question. So if you've seen prior videos, you know that we have descriptive questions. Descriptive, you get the point. And these are often answered by such things as mean, standard deviation, maybe median. I mean, that happens sometimes. You might also have like frequency if you're counting categorical data, etc. Frequency, proportions. This is how you address descriptive questions. These are the tools you use to answer those type of questions. Now, when you have comparison, you answer these with t-test. You can answer them with ANOVA. Again, we're not going to go over the statistical tools. We're just going to provide a list. So for comparison questions, you use t-test, you use ANOVA. For relationship questions, we use such things as correlation. So CRR for short. We use regression, etc. So these are the tools you use to answer these three type of questions that you commonly see in quantitative social science research. And this is how it is done. So it's broken down basically where you have descriptive stats. It's kind of used for the first two. You might also, I might want to put confidence intervals up here as well. That's also up there. And you have inferential stuff down here. That's kind of how it works out. And so this is very, very important because when you know what your choices are when it comes to shaping your analysis, it makes it much easier to make decisions. I've worked with many, many students who think that this process is mysterious, when in reality, when it comes to quantitative research, you basically have three types of questions and you have maybe 6 or 7 commonly used tools. Now, again, as you mature, you're going to see that there's lots of other tools you can use, like there's so many different types of regression and there's so many different types of ANOVA. But the fact remains the same that you basically have 7 or 8 commonly used statistical tools, no matter if you're an undergrad student all the way up to an advanced professor somewhere at a very, very prestigious university. It's just all about being comfortable with the tools that you can use to answer the questions. So let me just give you an example of this real quick. We're going to go right here. And so my data analysis is just one little simple paragraph here. Now, this analysis is a little bit more complicated for the study or for the examples I'm giving you. But basically, to make it as simple as possible, I use a type of regression here. I'm not going to read this to you, but you can see it right there for yourself. And you have to explain, what you're doing. And so also to save space, because there's often limitations to how, the number of words. I omitted how I was going to share descriptive statistics like mean and standard deviation, because I'm working off the understanding that the reader knows that that's going to be provided without having to mention it directly. That's kind of what I did. Sometimes you can't follow all the steps because there's constraints in terms of the number of words you can use. So you have to kind of cut things out sometimes. Now, the last section is the ethics section. And honestly, sometimes this section is not even in a paper. It's kind of assumed that you took care of it. I'm just being completely honest right now. And it's omitted for that reason, because remember, there's always a space constraint in terms of like you got 5,000 words, 4,000 words, whatever. and you have to find ways to cut. But in the ethics section, which that will be in your dissertation or your thesis, if you're doing a thesis, you're going to have your internal review board, how you submitted your study to be reviewed by people at the university, and they approved it on an ethical basis. Again, you need to talk to your advisor if you're a student. If you're already out there writing, you know what I'm talking about. And you have to assure certain things. I'll give you some examples. You got to ensure anonymity. In other words, people cannot be identified from the study. You also have to make sure you talk about consent, that people could choose to be in the study or not be in the study. You also have to talk about how there was no harm, nobody got hurt, there was nothing funny going on. And these are the four main components. Again, there might be more at your institution or for the journal you're applying for, but these are some basic ideas right here. And so just to take a quick look at this, we have it right here. And so when we go down, I have a section called ethical concerns. I talk about how I got permission. I talk about how I got permission from the university right here. That's an indirect way of saying I got IRB permission, internal review board. I talk about here anonymity, protecting their anonymity. Okay. I also talked about how they were invited and how it was optional. So I kind of cover most of my bases here. And that is essentially the major components of a methodology. So I want to review some of the ideas here, and then we're going to wrap up this particular video. So when we are trying to do a methodology for a social science research paper that is, of course, a quantitative, that's our focus of these videos, you want to make sure that you have a section that deals with your sample and settings, where you explain many of the 5 W's. Who's going to be in the study? Where was the study conducted at? How were the people selected to be in the study? And then sometimes you put demographic stats here. You know, it depends on the paper. Sometimes the demographic stats is moved to the results section. It depends on who you're working with. After that, you got to deal with your research design, RD. And that is where you try to explain the process you are going to use to go about to collect your data, and the scoring involved with that, the validity, the reliability. You want to look at, okay, how are you going to measure things in terms of like a Likert scale or, frequency or whatever, and also your data collection. How did you go about actually getting your data from your participants? The next section is, of course, your data analyst section. And that is where you explain basically what tools are you using to actually produce your answers. This is like the heart of it, right? So you have we know who's in your study. We know when it was done. We know how you got your data. We know how you collected it. Now, what tools are you going to use to actually get numerical values that are going to give us answers to our research questions? That is the data analysis part of your methodology. And so you have basically tools for descriptive questions, tools for comparison questions, and tools for relational questions or relationship questions. And those different tools, there's about 7 or 8 altogether that you could put in different broad categories about that you use to answer these questions. And no matter who you are, from an undergrad freshman all the way to the highest levels of social science research, you're basically using about 7 different tools here. That's it. Now, in the final section, you have to deal with your ethics. That is where you talk about how you had peers look at your study to make sure it was ethically sound, that you're not going to be harming people, that you get their consent, that their identities will be protected. These are things that are addressed in the ethical section. And so these are the 4 parts that you are commonly going to find when you are trying to develop a methodology for a quantitative social science research paper. So my name is Darren Thomas. I am the Director of Educational Research Techniques. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and you take care.